Films, Mr. Martin Doblmeier. He is the director of Spiritual Audacity, the Abraham Heschel Story. Martin, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Willie. Pleasure to be back with you.
We're also honored to have with us Rabbi Dan Levin. He is the senior rabbi of Temple Beth El in Boca Raton, Florida. He is also a senior rabbinic fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute. Rabbi, welcome.
Honor to be here with everybody. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for joining us and being a part of this panel conversation. I believe we also have with us right now, we also have with us right now Vanessa Corredera. She serves as Associate Professor of English and Chair of the Department of English at Andrews University. Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
We also have with us Ms. Kayla Carmona. She is working on a dual degree. She is a graduate student working on her dual degree with Master of Social Work and MA in Youth and Young Adult Ministry. Kayla, we welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And last but certainly not least, we have with us also Dr. Jacques Ducan. He is Professor of Hebrew and Old Testament Exegesis Emeritus and Director of the Institute of Jewish Christian Studies at Andrews University. This is our panel group that will be serving us today. But as we get started, we want to start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get right into everything. Please join me, if you will. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for everything that we have seen so far, and we thank you even now for the life and ministry of Rabbi Heschel. For this next hour that we spend together, we pray that we will be enlightened even more, informed even more, and inspired all the more to serve you, even as Rabbi Heschel did. These things we pray. Amen. I'd like for us to get started by asking Mr. Doblmeier to speak to us. And if you don't mind, just take a little bit of time and tell us, what was your inspiration for pursuing this documentary? What was it that inspired you about Rabbi Heschel? And what does his life, his teachings, what do they say to you today in 2021?
Well, thank you, Will. It's nice to be part of this conversation, and thanks too, because we had this was actually essentially a premiere of the film that we had this afternoon for Andrews. I'm delighted that was able to happen. So a little background on the story. I've been doing documentary films only on subjects of religion, faith, and spirituality now for about 35 years. And so I had always admired Rabbi Heschel. And a number of years ago, I did a documentary film on the great American public theologian. His name was Reinhold Niebuhr. And in making that film, I had the chance to interview Susanna Heschel, who I've known for many years. When I made the film on Bonhoeffer, I met Susanna Heschel. And when we got talking after the interview finished, she said, when you finish with this film on Reinhold Niebuhr, would you be open to doing a film about my father? And I said, I'm very touched, but let me finish the film on Reinhold Niebuhr first and see how you like it. And if you're okay about it, then we can start to talk about that later. And the film finished, and we were very pleased. She was pleased with the film, and we were pleased with the way the film went. And so I put that into the mix. And what I actually did was made a decision that I would take a look at a number of people that we consider to be prophetic voices of the 20th century, people who were deeply grounded in their faith tradition, and from that grounding were able to take it out and transform the world. So Reinhold Niebuhr became the first story in that series. The second one I talked about today in the presentation was on Howard Thurman. Third one was on the Catholic social activist Dorothy Day. And this last one, the fourth in the series, is on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And as you saw, Susanna Heschel, I thought, played a wonderful role in the film. She's both a wonderful scholar of the time period, because she has done her own studies on the churches in Germany at the time of the buildup of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists. But of course, she can share stories about her father and family life that only she could share. So this is very difficult, not only for her, but for everybody involved with this. I mean, I think one of the lines, if I'm, now the film is literally just finished in the last couple of weeks, so it's still very fresh for all of us, and we're still trying to process how we're going to look at the film and talk to people. I'm going to be listening. I'll be very interested today to hear how people respond, what they saw in the film. But one of the things that I think keeps coming up for me is that line that I wanted to have at the very beginning of the film, where Heschel says that I'm an optimist against my better judgment. And I believe in God, and that he will have, and I'm convinced that he'll have pity and mercy on us more than we deserve. Now, this is coming from a man who lost 3 members of his family, who had seen he was there in the 1930s during the rise of Adolf Hitler. He saw what was happening, and yet he still wants to be an optimist. We can talk a little later about where that all comes from, but I think that says that this man was able to live out of a value of hope, understood exactly what it meant to be able to stand up against oppression, to speak truth to power, and to do so with authority. And I think the more I studied Heschel and in preparation for making the film, the more I really admired him. I just admired him. And his words, his language keeps coming back again and again and again. I mean, it's almost as if he was able to look forward and think that we're going to now, in the 21st century, be speaking in like 20 and 30-second little clips, little bumper sticker isms. And Heschel could do that. He could sort of condense major notions into ways that all of us could get our arms around. And I think that's one of the reasons why he continues to endure. The idea that he says some are guilty, but all are responsible. And I think that's really a key concept, because we're all a part of this. That reverberates down through Martin Luther King Jr. It reverberates through the civil rights movement. It's the notion that we all have to participate in identifying what's going on with evil and do something about it. One of the people that I really admire that comes out of that Second World War period was a man by the name of Martin Niemöller. And Niemöller was a famed U-boat, a German submarine captain in World War I. And therefore, he was really on the list of the favorites of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s as Hitler's growing in power. But by the middle of the 1930s, Niemöller, who's a pastor, a German pastor, and a brilliant man, he was one of the people involved in the Confessing Church. He said that I can't have any part of this. And he resisted Adolf Hitler. And in the end, he winds up spending 7 years of his life, really right through the Second World War, in prison. And he was identified and put in prison. And then afterwards, he realized what was at stake here, what had failed to happen at the beginning of the rise of Adolf Hitler. And he said it in a succinct way that still, I think, reverberates now decades and decades afterwards. He said, when they came for the socialists, I was not a socialist, so I did nothing about it. When they came for the union workers, the trade union workers, I was not a trade worker, so I did nothing to stop it. When they came for the Jews, I was not a Jew, and so I did nothing to stop it. And then when they came for me, there was nobody there to stop it. And I think those kinds of thoughts, nicely packed together for all of us to remember and carry with us, were really the things that I think really reverberated through that period of post-World War II. How could this possibly happen? Why did this happen? Where did we fail? Where did we not see this? And of course, all of us now want to take those ideas and apply them to what's going on, to our current moment in history. So I think I made the decision to make these 4 documentary films on these biographical characters, Heschel being the last one. And I think the reason is clear, that we, in each and every case, we have something that we can draw that really applies to us in our conflicts today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. As the documentary began, it started with some film clips of Bloody Sunday. Many of us are so very familiar with that. Other elements of the civil rights movement. And throughout, there were images of the civil rights movement and discussion about events in the 1960s. I'd like to ask this question to all of the panelists, but I would especially appreciate it, Rabbi Levin, if you could be the first one to jump in concerning this. To all of you, I ask this question. What are your thoughts on Rabbi Heschel regarding his contributions to the civil rights movement that took place in the 1950s and 1960s?
So first of all, thank you. And it was an incredible blessing to see this extraordinarily well done documentary. I had such a privilege reviewing it in advance of our panel today. And I kept looking for notes to find things to make sure that, I could plug this in about something that maybe the filmmaker missed. He didn't miss anything. He did such a magnificent job in really sharing with us the life of this brilliant, extraordinary teacher. So thank you so much. I look forward, hopefully, to screening this in my congregation. What's amazing is that in that period of the late 1950s and the 1960s, there was in the Jewish community and I think the budding civil rights community a sense of shared common purpose. In the Deep South, it was not an uncommon thing to see signs on public accommodations that would say, no Jews, blacks, or dogs allowed. And so for many in the Jewish community who certainly had it easier without question than those in the Black community, the sting of prejudice and intolerance that the African American community was made to suffer in the Deep South was something with which we could find common cause and common purpose. Though at the same time, there was a sense that the Jewish community had some ways in which they could help the budding civil rights community. So, for example, there's an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Their headquarters, which is on DuPont Circle, was founded by a rabbi named Dick Hirsch. Dick was very close friends with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a mentor to him in some ways. And so when SNCC was looking for a headquarters or office space in Washington, Dick said, why don't you use space in my building? And so the original headquarters of some of those early civil rights movement organizations were in a Jewish building. The Voting Rights Act was drafted on the conference room table of that building. There was a group of reform rabbis before the March in Selma that went down to St. Augustine to try to lend support there, also at not insignificant risk to their own safety. But what Rabbi Heschel had, which was so well, I think, articulated in the movie, was this prophetic presence by virtue not only of his biography, but of his eloquence. And just to give you a sense of the brilliance of this man, you read his prose and it reads like poetry. And English was his fourth language. He grew up speaking Yiddish and Polish. He learned German, obviously. And then when he came to the United States was when he learned English. And you think about the eloquence that you find in any of his writing, it's really almost overwhelming. But he had this capacity to be a symbolic leader because of his presence. And that was not, I'm sorry, if I don't move, my lights turn off in my office. And there we go, let there be light. But what Rabbi Heschel was able to bring was a national prominence to the work. And so his presence, like on Bloody Sunday or in other moments in the civil rights movement, brought a national appreciation more than some of the other Jewish figures that collaborated in the early civil rights movement.
I'd love to hear from others also on this panel. What are your thoughts concerning Rabbi Heschel, concerning his contributions to the civil rights movement?
I first of all, thank you so much for this extraordinary film. It was such a pleasure and privilege to be able to watch it. And I would just say that there are two pieces that I think are really important connecting it to today. And first, I think he becomes this really great example of what it looks like and what it means to be an ally. So he's willing to carry burdens for others, right? His daughter talks about he had this heart condition, and yet he stands at the front, but not standing at the front so that his voice overpowers, but so that he helps keep attention, so that he brings that sort of solidarity that needed to be seen, right? That this wasn't just a Southern issue, that this wasn't just an issue for African Americans, it was an American issue and a moral issue. And I think it is just such an excellent example to those of us who want to stand up for what it's right, but who need to also make sure that we're carrying the burden, not just the shine of what it means to be involved in social justice efforts. And I also think that the other thing that he really exemplifies is a multifaceted approach. I think in this world where news is 24/7 and it pings on my watch and my phone, and it can be really overwhelming. And that's okay to feel overwhelmed. But he didn't just have one cause, right? And that's what he tells Dr. King. He says, "Oh, I need your voice to speak back against the war in Vietnam." And so he's thinking about what it means to practice Judaism in a particular way and in what he feels is a more scripture-oriented way, right? That's his personal and professional life. He's speaking back against the war in Vietnam. It talked about, he was reminding people not to turn away from the plight of Jewish individuals in Russia, right? And then he's fighting the good fight on the civil rights movement. And it just shows that it is exhausting, but it is important to take a multifaceted approach too, right? That we need to speak up for all of those who need a voice. Because we can commit ourselves so much. It's like, I don't have time and energy for that. And of course we can't all do all things. But he gave as much as he possibly could. And I think that's also just another amazing model. It's aspirational. It's an aspirational model for each and every one of us.
If I could add on
Yes,
to what's
please.
already been said, first, the documentary was beautiful, and it really shined a light on the need to know, right, the background information to a lot of these stories that we hear, because there's so much more information that shines a light. So I think another thing that Rabbi Heschel was able to bring was this awareness of your spiritual life cannot be disconnected from your life that happens during the rest of the week, right? Of what you do during your times of worship on the weekend, right? God literally expects us to carry that out during the week, specifically when it pertains to people who are suffering and people who are oppressed, right? His example and his brilliant mind brought to the forefront that those two things aren't distant, but rather God expects them to be hand in hand. And that doesn't just apply, right, to those who are directly affected to that pain, right? If you believe in God, then, right, and therefore you should be connected to this. So his impact and bringing that to the forefront, I feel, brought a lot of other people to this fight of justice and to speak out and say, hey, my faith is not disconnected from my viewing of suffering and pain. So yeah.
Well, consider this then. As we stated, when Dr. King called people to come together to march in Selma, from Selma to Montgomery, he called together individuals of various faith communities. And all of this was in an effort to bring about some level of healing as it relates to the divisions among the races. What, in your opinions, would Rabbi Heschel say to faith communities today as it relates to their role in effecting healing among the races? Yes, Dr. Dukan, please.
I'm sorry I joined a little later. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had a little
Thank you.
technical
Thank you so
problem.
much for joining us.
I wasn't able to join you from the very beginning. I must say how much I was moved to watch this little document especially in those days. Today, I mean, it is so relevant, and I felt as if really the prophet was speaking to us through him. So that was my first personal emotion I received, as you know, I sensed as I watched this movie. I just wanted to say something there, and perhaps if you allow me, I just want to answer your first question here.
Yes.
From actually something I heard, I read, you know, from Abraham Heschel. He was a philosopher and also a prophet. I mean, it has been said that even in the document, making the two persons together, the two voices together. And what is interesting is, and what he said somewhere in his writing is, he was comparing the two voices, the voice of the philosopher and the voice of the prophet. And he said that the philosopher makes you think, which is very important, right? We have to think. But the prophet makes you commit, be involved, be alive in history. And I felt that as I was watching the movie, this document, that's precisely what Abraham Heschel did. He was not just a philosopher. Many philosophers, and especially in the context of the Holocaust and in the context of the, you know, of this particular event, there were many philosophers even before the Holocaust, like German philosophers who were experts in thinking, but they great thinkers actually, but they did not want to be involved. They remained. They thought, as philosophers, they had nothing to do with, nothing to say about you know, the events. And this is precisely where Abraham Heschel was different. He was not just a philosopher, a thinker, but he was also, you know, committed, involved in action. To see him on the front, on the march, this is so engaging, this is so moving, this is so important. And this is what I received from him again. Now, perhaps if I may, you know, to perhaps say something about the second question, which I feel is the most important, at least for me. It's perhaps the most important thought I learned from Abraham Heschel. He said somewhere, the secret, and he was talking to religious people. He said, the secret is to be human and holy. And if there is something that religious people, churches, you know, synagogues, mosques could understand, should understand, is the beauty, the value of that tension. Many religious people, they are experts in being holy, but by being holy, they miss to be human. And what Abraham Heschel is teaching to us is that you cannot be holy if you're not human. And in a way, also, you cannot be human if you're not holy. And to bring these two together, to churches, to synagogues, to even countries where you have two ideals opposed to each other, you know, an ideal of God, of the transcendence, in opposition, in conflict with the ideal of relating to humans. This is a voice which we need to hear today, more than perhaps in any other time. So that's the lesson I learned from Abraham. That's the thing I would like to share and to read with, you know, on in that particular context to your question.
Thank you, Rabbi Levin.
So I'm grateful for those comments, and also what Ms. Cordero and Ms. Carmona shared earlier, this idea of what does it mean to be an ally. You know, if you take the sort of the two elements of Dr. Heschel's life and experience, on the one hand, he's a deeply religious man. He comes out of this Hasidic world where it's not just about embracing the letter of the law, it's about embracing the spirit of the law and allowing that spirit to animate your spirit, to be driven by more than just a legalistic, did I check the right box at the right time in the right way, but to allow that spirit to infuse the fullness of every moment of every day. This idea that you see in Hasidic Judaism of pan-sacramentalism, this idea that everything and everyone in every moment is holiness potential, and that it's our duty to activate that potential. So Heschel in his theology comes at this place of moral awareness through a lens of grandeur, of what he calls the embarrassment of living. And from that place of humility, of just how extraordinary it is to be a human being in a particular moment in history, what does that drive you in terms of duty? So if you take a look at the prophet par excellence in the Hebrew scriptures, the being of Moses, in that moment of meeting between the Holy One and Moses, before the burning bush, God says to Moses in 5 separate ways, I'm aware of the suffering of the Israelites. The suffering of the Israelites, those enslaved people, has come before me, and I feel compelled to act now. Moses says, who am I that I should go before Pharaoh in Egypt? And the most amazing element of that passage is that God doesn't really answer the question. God just says, I will be with you. Sorry for my office light. But what is being suggested there is this idea of divine partnership, that it's not up to the divine to complete the repair of the brokenness in the world. It's up to us to be the partners that God needs. And that partnership is not exclusively through a Jewish lens. It's not exclusively through a Jewish path. And as you articulated so well in the documentary, when he was working through Vatican II on Nostra Aetate, he was saying, don't denigrate my path, even as I recognize that you can have your path while I have mine. I think that sense of embrace of the prophetic tradition was one that married this idea of wonder to action. And that sense of living one's faith was paramount, which really drove him from the academy later in his career onto literally the front lines of the social issues of the day. At a time, as you suggested, that not every academic saw that to be compelling. And when you consider his experience of the Holocaust, he survived because people were willing to take action. Literally, as he would say, a brand plucked from the fire. He and other academics and rabbinic students were literally rescued from Germany and brought here to be able to fulfill their lives. And he recognized that were it not for someone who stood up, who acted, as you suggested earlier, that moral challenges are not met or solved. And I think that's really, really crucial to the way that he would look at interreligious partnership in our world today.
I was also going to add, that's a good point, but I was also going to add too that what I find really inspiring for me is that because it's Martin Luther King Day, I'm thinking about King, through the lens of King to Heschel, and this unique friendship that they had. I mean, they meet at a conference that's set up to talk about religion and race, and Heschel is there, and Heschel and King become associates to begin with. They recognize, as we say in the film, this sort of kindred spirit. Heschel is really almost not quite a father figure. He's 22 years older than Martin Luther King Jr. And yet you didn't see any professional jealousy in any way at all between the two of them, because I think they really recognized in both of them, not just their trajectory of study, but also the loss, the pain that they both were speaking out of, that Heschel had lost so much already in the Second World War and the Holocaust, and that he recognized the pain that King had suffered over so many years, and in that commitment to stay in the civil rights movement. And I think Heschel and King had this real love for their sacred texts. They were really scholars in their own way, the genuine scholars. And so they really met, despite the age difference between the two of them, they met on a unique peer level. And I think in many ways they could help guide each other in their own spiritual journey. We see them as people on this sort of social transformation journey. But I think we forget that at the time this is all unfolding, they were all continuing in their own personal spiritual journey. And I think they found that they could take leaps forward together in their own spiritual journeys just by the friendships and the associations.
Last year, we saw movements that many of us in our own lifetimes have not seen. Now, of course, there's some who remember events that took place during the 1960s. Some of us who are viewing are not able to remember that. But when we think back to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others going all the way down in time from last year all the way to what happened on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and inside the Capitol building just a couple of weeks ago, for many of us, these have been 9, 10, 11, 12 months like no other months, certainly in our histories. In light of all of this, do you have any reflections on Rabbi Heschel's words, either by pen or by voice, that would address anything that ranges from civil rights to Black Lives Matter to the events that happened on Capitol Hill two Wednesdays ago? What would be going on in his heart right now if he were alive to see all of these things that are taking place?
I would suggest a few things. One of Heschel's very famous book is called A Passion for Truth. And I think that he would, over the last several years, have been aghast at the number of people in prominent positions of power in public life who chose not to speak out against falsehood. I think that would have inspired him to continue to be, if he were here, that conscience, that voice, in the way that Dr. King was that conscience, that voice. And I think there are people who are bringing that voice, but not in the way that Dr. King was able to bring it, and not on the national stage in the way that he was able to be there. I think that would, Heschel wrote at the end of that book, truth is alive, dwelling somewhere, never weary, and all of mankind is needed to liberate it. And I think he would see it as his fundamental duty to speak out against the massive imposition of falsehood and untruth that we see proliferating, and that which came to a head on Wednesday the 6th, but that we still see reverberating in every corner of the internet today. I think that is one element where I'm sure Dr. Heschel would have joined with Dr. King in trying to speak truth to power, emphasis on the truth. The second thing is that I believe that Dr. Heschel, like Dr. King, truly understood the intrinsic, inherent, illimitable value of a single human life. I think that's what drove his activism against the war in Vietnam, because it was the suffering of an individual, innocent civilian halfway across the world that compelled him to push for us to be, as a country, immediately disentangled from that conflict. He understood that that conflict was imminently more complicated than we in America were willing to understand or embrace. In particular, our inability to even speak the Vietnamese language put us at a marked disability to understand the Vietnamese people, their needs, wants, and desires. And I think that that idea that the soul of an individual person is of limitless value and worthy of dignity, care, and concern by all of humanity would have been, I think, a call that he would have said in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is to say that these people who seem to be marginalized, these people who seem to be irrelevant, are the most relevant people. In his work, when he wrote an essay later about my reasons for involvement in the peace movement, he wrote, "There is immense silent agony in the world, and the task of man is to be a voice for the plundered poor, to prevent the desecration of the soul and the violation of our dream of honesty." So I think he would have seen that plight of the those who have no voice, those who are oppressed, those who are not understood by virtue of their soul, but by what is presented by the outside, perhaps because of the amount of melatonin in their skin, as being a blight, a sin on humanity that needed to be redeemed and atoned.
Yes, Dr. Corradera.
I really appreciate what Rabbi Levin said about truth, because that and the quote early on in the film where he's talking about, I teach night every spring. And one of the questions in that testimony is, where is God, right? Where is God in this camp? Where is God when all of this is happening? And even though it wasn't the focus of the entire documentary, it was a piece. There was this moment where it's, where is God? And Heschel says, but my approach to that is, well, God would say, where were you? Right. And I think that connects to this question of truth and this idea of each and every person having the opportunity to be a prophet, not someone who can tell the future, but someone who can speak truth. And that makes sense why he and Dr. King were such good friends, because they were both committed to speaking truth to power at deep cost and deep personal investment. And I love how several people here have been interweaving that with their spiritual journeys. And I think particularly for religious communities, whatever they are, this idea of needing to speak truth to power, which sometimes is your own community, right? It is your own religious leaders. It can be your parents. It can be your teachers. It can be your classmates, your employers. That is really challenging. And, I was struck by, I think because I'm a professor, how he was the outsider professor in his group, right? He was doing his own thing. And I'm not saying that that's me. I'm just saying I was struck by that, I think, because I teach too. And, but that didn't stop him. And I think that is really profound, that this is an embodiment of one's relationship with the divine. It is a form of worship. It's what, as someone put in the comments, it's the speaking truth is what gives you the right to worship, because you're pushing back against oppression and you're exposing the nature of God to humanity. And as Rabbi Levin said, in different ways, right? Everyone might take a different path, but these are each different pieces of the puzzle of the ineffable. And I thought that was just absolutely profound, how we are part of the divine's mission here on this earth, that we get to be prophets, that we're given the privilege of participating, but we have to do the difficult work, especially when we see George Floyd, when we see what happened at the Capitol. We wonder, where is God? What is happening? Where are we, right? And how can we be tools to speak truth to the negative powers that are pushing back against us?
Yes. If I can hear from Ms. Carmona and then Dr. Duthon.
Okay, but please go ahead.
Thank you. So when I think about how Abraham Heschel would have responded to all that's happened, and so much has happened in the past year, I went after watching the documentary and looked up his speech at the conference in Illinois in 1963, and something he said stuck out to me. He said, "Equality as a religious commitment goes beyond the principle of equality before the law. Equality as a religious commandment means personal involvement, fellowship, mutual reverence, and concern. It means my being hurt when a Negro is offended. It means that I am bereaved whenever a Negro is disenfranchised." And so when I think about what his response would have been, right, to all that's happened, I think he would have been deeply saddened by all that happened last year. But I think also in the response of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, I think he would have been heartened by that, right? The documentary spent a lot of time speaking about how he wanted to show that indifference would cause a lot of hurt and would cause more oppression. And so the global response to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right? That response of the world saying, this is not okay. This is not all right. I think had he been here, he would have been at the forefront right along with them saying, they're right. These young people and people from across the globe, from different cultures and religious backgrounds. This is what I think his life's work was working towards. And so I think while he would have been deeply saddened, he would have been very heartened to see that there is this movement of people who will not sit by and watch while people are hurt, but they will feel deeply the pain of others and will stand up and say, this is enough. I can't sit by and watch this happen. So yeah.
Dr. Doblmeier.
Yeah, I think that the phrase Black Lives Matter contains a whole thinking and a whole program and a whole project, which actually could have triggered something in Abraham Heschel. It's, by the way, it's a little humbling to imagine what Abraham Heschel would have, would think. But as far as this question is concerned, it's not very difficult, because when you make that particular statement, Black Lives Matter, you suggest that perhaps it doesn't matter. And this is something which would have certainly, challenged and triggered some kind of revolt on the part of Abraham Heschel. Because if his life doesn't matter, my life doesn't matter, human life doesn't matter, there is a big problem there. And I think this is where Abraham Heschel would have, how he would have responded. He would have responded with anger, with revolt, and with personal answer. Because if this life doesn't matter, that means he is also himself threatened. If the other, who is also another myself, is threatened, I am threatened. And this is what, by the way, the experience of the Holocaust, and which Abraham Heschel is emphasizing very often. The reason why we had the Holocaust is because it did not matter. And if it did not matter for them, this is what we should learn. If it doesn't matter for them, it doesn't matter for me. If he is threatened, I am threatened. So there is a personal response, a personal chord here. It has to do even with the survival. I mean, I would not be able to survive in a place where another myself, life would not matter. So that's, the kind of, comment which I think would have be in the mouth and in thinking of Abraham Heschel, if I may.
Thank you so much. I don't know if we have any questions from our viewing audience, but if we do, I'd like to come to that in just a moment. But Dr. Doblmeier, you just brought up something about the Holocaust. And of course, any event such as that is usually preceded by some type of political discourse. And historically, we understand that there was political discourse that took place that led up to that, in the same way the political discourse has led up to some of the things that you all have been talking about here in this conversation. Would Rabbi Heschel consider it fair or unfair? And I'm tossing this question out to whoever wishes to address it. Would he consider it fair or unfair to draw comparisons between the time of the preceding the Holocaust as it relates to political discourse and political discourse that takes place in our times, here in the 21st century?
May I just make a little note here? Very quick answer. There is someone, I don't remember his name right now, but it's very an important writer, who said, if you forget history, you are condemned to repeat it. And so if we forget the lessons of the Holocaust, you are condemned to repeat it. So I feel, I think your question is certainly a valuable one. We should not forget, unless we repeat it. So that would be perhaps something to say, in introduction to that kind of, to that discussion.
Thank you. Anyone else? And then we want to take some time if there are any questions from our audience. And by the way, a program such as this cannot take place without people that you do not see on the screen making it possible. So I just have to give a shout out to those that you don't see who are making this very possible right now. Any of our other panelists, would you like to address that question? And thank you again, Dr. Doblmeier, for that very insightful statement that you just shared.
So I think that the Jewish community often gets a little defensive around comparisons to the Holocaust because it was such a unique event in human history. And because I think there is no need to necessarily get into competitive suffering. Was my genocide as good as your genocide? I don't know that that ever is a conversation that gets us anywhere. I think each individual historic epoch, when you see humanity's inhumanity, has its own tenor and shape to it. Certainly in the United States, the oppression of Black and Brown people for centuries has its own unique place in history and should be understood and remedied for itself, not in comparison or distinction to other events. That said, I think that there is, without question, a sensitivity when you see certain kinds of fascist behaviors replicated in modern times, when you know what the trajectory of that kind of behavior can lead toward. One of the things that I always admired about Dr. Heschel was his profound humility, despite his towering eminence as a scholar and as a public figure in his later years. In his book, A Passion for Truth, he is reminded of a passage by the German playwright and thinker Gotthold Lessing, who writes, "If God should held enclosed in his right hand all truth, and in his left hand only the ever active impulse after truth, although with the condition that I must always and forever err, I would with humility turn to his left hand and say, Father, give me this, pure truth is for thee alone." And I think that that was really what I think Heschel understood, was that no matter how enlightened we become, none of us are possessors of a monopoly on the truth. That the truth is an asymptote toward which we are always striving to better understand, but never in complete possession. I think that that's what animated the way in which he worked with faith leaders. And I think it was that, I think one of the things in modern society that would have plagued Heschel was this denigration of expertise, and this idea that truth was something that one ought not even bother trying to understand or to hold. Because to Heschel, it was that pursuit of the truth that would then animate one's pursuit of justice hand in hand with that pursuit. And so I think in answer to your question, he would see some of the things that are happening in society, the allowance for untruth, the allowance for the denigration of the disempowered, and see those as clarion calls to action, as they have been not simply in the 1930s in Europe, but as they have been really across the centuries in history.
Thank you. Do we have, I'm unable to keep track of this conversation and what's going on in the question and answer area. Steve, thank you for joining us here. Do we have a question or two in our time remaining from our viewing audience?
Yes, certainly we do. There's been a lot of interest. And one listener says, first, thank you, Martin Doblmeier, for the gift of this film and making Heschel available to us today. And then goes on to ask a question about what do we learn from Heschel about how to take up this interfaith work of truth-telling in this deadly time of polarization. And on that theme, another listener goes on to say that Abraham Heschel actively engaged with other faith traditions, institutions, and leaders while remaining devotedly faithful to Judaism. What do you think was key to his success and to his approach to ecumenical and intra or interfaith engagements? So there's some real interest there in what we can learn from Heschel about interfaith labors.
Yes, can we get Martin to respond to that, and then Dr. Dukan?
I think one of the people that I really came to admire in the process of making the film was Rabbi Shai Held. He's up in New York. And the line that he uses to talk about that particular question is that Heschel came to believe that God wanted to be worshiped in different ways. And that really resonated for me, because I'm always we're taking it from our position, looking from our point of view to God. And we look towards each other to say how our religions are and our faith traditions are different. This is kind of Howard Thurman, too, who wanted to break down those barriers of faith traditions and find the common ground between all of us. But the notion that God wants to be worshiped, honored, and adored certainly in different languages, but certainly in different faith traditions, I thought was a really different way to turn that. And I think that's really what Heschel came to. He was committed to this interfaith work, but I also think that he was able to put this notion together that if we are, as faith traditions, working together, we can actually solve these problems that we're facing against commonly. And I think that's really one of the most important things that we as faith traditions have to say. Yes, there's questions why organized institutional religion is facing a decline. It was not happening in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, quite the opposite. Institutional religion was on the rise in the 1950s and 60s all across America. It's not the case now in 2020 and in our time period, because the opposite has happened. And I think in some ways, the notion that what side of history do you want to be on? And I think as we enter this new decade, I think it's really important for the faith traditions to decide what side of history do they want to be on? Do they want to help take the faith tradition that they believe in so sincerely and turn it towards social and political transformation in their world? Or do they simply want to sit back and hide within their own enclaves and not do the tough work of hope to make a better world for us?
Dr. Dukan.
This is a very important, and certainly in this particular circle, an interesting question, and I can read already behind the question all kinds of things. In a way, Abraham Heschel has answered that question with just one little statement, playing on the word of the poet who was saying, no man is an island. He took this and turned this into no religion is an island, as if there was a connection between the two ideas. If I may reflection on that, that would suggest to me that we cannot survive ourselves, by having just the truth and the other one doesn't have anything to say about the truth. The day, if sometime we are tempted to think that we have the truth and the only one who have the truth, we have the absolute truth and the other one doesn't have, we are missing something very important. And I think we are missing something about actually a message we need to hear. If God does not speak through the other, we are not hearing him. That's something we need to learn. And in a way, you can say, I have something that you don't have, provided that you realize that the other one has also something you don't have. So I think just by taking that phrase, no man, no religion, was myself confused, no man and no religion is an island, can develop on that. And I think then you may get up to something which is the truth of God. The truth of God is not your only truth. It's not something you possess, you own. And there you would be open to the truth of the other. You would be open to the truth of the big other. And then something will happen. This is unfortunate that sometimes religion, which is supposed to bring people together in connection to God, has divided. He made another statement, which is kind of related. He said, the reason why we've lost the sense of fatherhood is because we lost the sense of, the reason why we lost the sense of brotherhood is because we lost the sense of fatherhood. And you come back to another realization that the reason where we have the problem today, perhaps, it's because people do not realize that they are brothers. And when they realize the reason they are not realized, because they don't realize that there is someone who is above ourselves, who is our common father. And so that's a part of the problem. The ignorance of the transcendence is somehow affecting our relationship with each other.
I would add to what Dr. Dukan said so well. I think that one of the things that Heschel as a Jew brings is that Judaism was never a universalist kind of a tradition. It was a sense that Judaism was the way in which Jews were supposed to live, but it wasn't one that said this is how everybody is supposed to live. And I think that part of what made Heschel such a compelling figure was that he combined this intensity of passion for his own sense of authentic self with a humility of this is my truth. This is not necessarily everyone's truth. But what I think he was enamored with Dr. King was this idea of how nonviolence is the methodology by which we try to understand how much of our own individual truth is really a reflection of truth with a capital T. And that it's really only through nonviolence, as Gandhi would have taught, that you really ever discover truth. Because otherwise, through violence, you only know in the assertion of your own truth. And I think that's a big piece of what I think enabled Heschel to be successful in that kind of a dialogue, was that he was so utterly authentic and in possession, as the documentary showed so brilliantly. He knew everything. He knew more than all of the people who ever taught him. He had a wonderful friendship with his teacher, Martin Buber, the great existentialist, German existentialist, who also fled Nazi Germany and made his home in Jerusalem. In 1960, gave him a gift of a copy of the Talmud. And Dr. Buber said, well, thank you so much. I've never had this before. Even though he was this great Jewish and secular existential thinker, right? Heschel had it all. He had this incredible education and mastery of the classics of his own tradition, but at the same time understood the Western philosophical tradition, and at the same time wedded them both in a way that said, this is what I know, but it's not all. And I think by pulling that all together, it allowed him to, I think, as was said earlier so eloquently, to be a really effective ally with those who were different from him, but also to lobby for what he knew to be right. Specifically the work that he did at Vatican II, as the documentary points out, to not have that universalist language included in the final document, but the respect for Jews to be able to continue to live their lives as Jews, passionate for their own tradition and their own path. You can have many lanes in a swimming pool and everyone's swimming, right? Even if they're swimming different strokes.
If I could just add one more thing.
Yes, we'll take this and then we'll try to get to maybe one more question for you.
Yeah, no, just really quickly. I think we can't underestimate the effect of the Catholic Church, the global Catholic Church, making this turn in the 1960s, that it's going to open, it's going to be open to faith traditions. It's not just that Catholics began to open themselves up to Jews. In that same document, Nostra Aetate, they're talking about the openness to Islam and to Hinduism and to Buddhism. But Heschel's there as part of that dialogue. But when you have a church that's 1 billion people globally, and it makes that document say that we're no longer, we're going to come out of our own shells. We're going to say that other faith traditions have value, because prior to that, I mean, the Catholic Church taught that it was the only path to heaven was through the Catholic experience. And many faith traditions were holding on to that notion that only through our church is salvation really possible. Catholic Church made a big break there, and Heschel was really at the core of that transformation of thinking. So I think his role in all of this, and really the sort of the global movement towards interfaith dialogue and conversation, really can't be overstated.
Steve, I believe we have one more question at least one more question that you want to bring to us in this short amount of time that we have.
We have a lot of questions, but
okay.
There's two questions here that kind of converge on the Sabbath, and I wanted to bring those forward. First of all, one listener writes, Heschel wrote beautifully about the Sabbath. The Sabbath speaks profoundly to issues of social justice. In Heschel's civil rights and social justice work, did he apply the Sabbath to these issues? And then another listener writes, how does the concept of tikkun olam, repair of the world, which Heschel promoted, relate with the Sabbath? And how can we make it practical in our own religious observance and our respective faiths?
Dr. Dutham?
I will try and answer to that question, but I suppose the rabbi has certainly something to say here, important, and I'm eager to listen to him. There is a dimension on the Sabbath, in a way related to the preceding question of the truth and everything, which Abraham Heschel is bringing to our attention, and that is the poetic dimension, the mystical dimension. Sabbath is more than just not Sunday, by the way. And sometimes I have heard some people just focusing on that, and they miss something very important. It's, of course, not Sunday, but it's certainly infinitely more than that. And that is what Abraham Heschel is bringing to that reflection. This mystical, profound, poetic reflection, which takes you, to another world, in other words, another dimension. And I think if there is something that perhaps those who those Christians or even Jews who could learn from Abraham Heschel on the Sabbath, this is a very important contribution that indeed Abraham Heschel brought in his book on the Sabbath, and that is this reflection that this emphasis on time rather than on space, the emphasis on something which is essential, not visible, and that is in a way covering all the topics in a way. This is a universal topic if you understand it well. And this is where Abraham Heschel has something to say, which we should listen. And again, this is something where, we could say that no religion is an island. This is really the place where you learn to be not an island. And this is really the place where you learn something about God, which perhaps, should challenge you and take you, elsewhere, in a dream, to something else. And this attention to the space, to the visible, to success, to material, to the work, this is killing the human soul. And this is where Abraham Heschel would have certainly an important contribution to make.
Rabbi?
I'll speak briefly, but we have two other people on the panel, and I'm interested in my younger colleagues' thoughts on this. Heschel wrote in the Sabbath about how important it was that we use that time to realize that we are not the masters of ourselves, but that we owe a duty to a force and a power that is greater than ourselves. He wrote in the Sabbath, gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, man must fight for inner liberty, to remain independent of the enslavement of the material world. Inner liberty depends upon being exempt from domination of things as well as from domination of people. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only very few are not enslaved to things. This is our constant problem: how to live with people and remain free, how to live with things and remain independent. And I think that he used the vehicle of the Sabbath to talk about this idea of humility, of this idea that there are forces in the universe that get to make a claim on us, and that those forces can be the forces of time and holiness and the ineffable, and in the different ways that he had that mystical understanding and appreciation for God. But also, when you get out of your own way and you silence the noise and you are able to sit back and say, not what is it about me? What are my needs, my wants, my cares, my desires? And I shut all that off for one day out of 7. I make room in my consciousness for the other. And it's only when we make room in our consciousness for the other that we are ever able to create that sense of unity among humanity that will allow us to be one with each other and then one with our God, who we say is one. There is intrinsic in Jewish theology this idea that is when people become one with each other, that's where the special sauce is made. That's why the Sinai moment is so powerful in Jewish tradition. That's why that sense, I think, of the dignity of the individual halfway across the world in Vietnam was so compelling for Dr. Heschel, because if we can't be one with that anonymous farmer in a rice paddy in Southeast Asia, we will never achieve that sense of redemption for ourselves in our own time and place.
Other comments? Yes, Ms. Carmona, and I think Dr. Corradero wants to jump in after that. Please, both of you.
Yeah, so I think one of the beauty, right, one of the beautiful things that we see in the Sabbath when we look at that 4th commandment, right, is that God doesn't just say that you individually get rest, right? He says where you have the power and the authority to grant others rest, grant them rest, right? So the foreigner who's in your land, your maid, your cattle, right? So whoever, who is in your sphere of influence, because you have rest, you also need to extend rest to them. So I think, right, a question that Dr. Abraham Heschel would ask is, right, how can you truly have rest if those around you don't have rest? Right? If they don't feel, right, the lifting of the burden from their shoulder, how can you truly have rest, right, if those around you don't? And then if you look at the prophets, again and again, they would speak to, right, like you are observing this, right, the law, right, of how to observe the Sabbath, but there are all of these people around you who are oppressed, right? And how would God expect you to respond to these people, right? So you can't just live to the letter of the Sabbath if you don't live to the spirit of the Sabbath. And so when it comes to the intersection between what we believe and what we live, rest is something that God expects us to give as freely as we receive. So yeah.
Yes, Vanessa.
I was just going to come at the question not as a Heschel scholar or theologian, but as a lifelong Sabbath keeper, from a tradition where there is a lot of debate. For example, I remember one church I went to, we had to have a whole debate about whether I was in Chicago and the marathon, the breast cancer marathon was coming through, and should we be out there giving runners water and snacks? And is that an appropriate thing to do on a Saturday? The church decided yes, but the fact that there was a debate about this, right? And so because it was that working, and to me that seems like service. And my point is this: is Heschel, what I just loved at the beginning of the documentary, how it made it clear that he approached God differently, right? He understood a nature and essence of God in a way that absolutely transformed his relationship with the divine and his relationship with others. And there's a question here about, well, what do we tell young people about history? And we don't have time to answer that. But I would say that we can tell young people something certainly about the Sabbath and about the God they understand. And if the God that you see in scripture, who in Isaiah, for example, if you're studying the Adventist Sabbath School lesson, says, you're giving me sacrifices, you're keeping my Sabbaths, and you're exhausting me, right? Says, because you're not taking care of the widow, and you're not taking care of the orphan, and you're not doing this with any spirit. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But if you understand that God and what that God wants from you, then it is up to you, like Heschel, to change your community. And maybe that means Andrews or your church or your home. And it is up to you, and you have the power to articulate that to others and to be that change, to change what it means then to keep the Sabbath, so that you're not worrying about, am I up to my ankles or to my knees, and have I sweat and have I not? And, I mean, that, what is that? right? That's thinking only about yourself. What am I doing right in this moment, right? It's not relationship with God or relationship with others. And I just see so many people, and I understand why, because I share this exhaustion leaving the Adventist church. And I don't know if there are similar flights in Judaism or not, with a certain generational flights, but you don't have to leave, you can transform. And it's exhausting, it's really hard, but that's what he tried to do. And that's why we're still talking about him today. And there's that room for that audacity. And that's my hope as a believer, that we continue in that audacious path, because that is the path that I see reflecting scripture and reflecting a true understanding of, what Ms. Carmona was saying, this kind of embodied Sabbath. So just kind of speaking to the young people, just, right, be that person, be that, he started when he was young. He was started very, very young. You can be that person too. I'm not sure any of us can promise someone's going to make a documentary about you, but you can absolutely be that voice. And I hope to see that for the future of not just, say, the Adventist community, but all our communities, our interfaith communities, and our local and national communities too.
Oh, yes, please, Martin. I thought you were about to say something.
Well, no, I was simply
Okay.
going to add, as a non-Adventist, I have spent an enormous amount of time in Adventist churches all across America and outside and beyond. And I can't tell you how deeply impressed time and time again I am about how serious and spiritually attracted Adventists are to the notion of Sabbath. It's fundamental to your sense of how do you relate to God, and you do have that as a way that you connect to the Jewish tradition. I've always seen that throughout the course of American history, how Adventists and Jews connected. But I come back time and time again telling so many people how Adventists take the Sabbath seriously, and it becomes the anchor and the centeredness for them. And I admire that so much.
Before we wrap up this afternoon, let me just say that these last 2+ hours have been an absolutely remarkable and fascinating time spent together, each with the other. I want our viewers to take a look at this panel and express appreciation to the planning committee that worked so diligently to put this stellar group of men and women together to share their thoughts and their reflections on this documentary. Let me start in order by saying, Martin Doblmeier, thank you, thank you, thank you for a magnificent documentary. This same time last year, we screened on campus the Howard Thurman story, and that was magnificent as well. And 2 years in a row, if I can say it, you're 2 for 2.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
To all of our panelists, Rabbi Dan Levin, thank you so much. We know it's warm where you are. You can go and enjoy the rest of that warmth right now, as opposed to where some of the rest of us are right now. Dr. Vanessa Corredera, thank you. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Ms. Kayla Carmona, thank you. And Dr. Dukan, as always, my pleasure to have you a part of any panel that I'm a part of, or anytime I'm in the same presence with you. Thank you so much for sharing. And for those who you don't see, who are working so diligently to make all of this work, no technical difficulties that I'm aware of. They're so good, they know how to clean it up, and I don't even know what's going on. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for taking up your time to participate in this Martin Luther King Day event. As we have looked at all of these things that we have looked at, we pray that as a result of our time together this afternoon, that you have not only been informed, but you've been inspired to be agents of change, to make a difference, to brighten the corner where you are, and to let the good Lord use you in every which way that he chooses to see fit. Until we come together again for another event, may the Lord bless you and keep you. So long.
Thank you.